Michigan, Utah, BYU, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Pittsburgh, and even Arkansas, though you probably could have put the even before Pittsburgh. That probably would have been more appropriate for today's video. And I say that because each of these 7 teams, they don't have a lot in common. They're from different conferences. BYU even is a group of 5 school. But what I think makes all of these teams, what unites them is, in my personal opinion, these 7 teams have a very realistic and good chance to punch their ticket to the CFP. And this is not a hot take. It's not a hot take at all. This is a genuine take of mine. I've looked at each of these teams, some obviously deeper than others because I either have a greater interest in them or because it's easier for me to find information about them. But I've looked at all these teams, and I think that all of these teams can punch their ticket to the playoff in, again, very realistic manner without much outside help. I think that in order to reach the playoff, winning it is a different story, but to reach the playoff, you have to have one of the 2 great staff or great players. To win it, you really have to have both. But to just reach it, you really have to have a great staff or great players. And most of these schools, I think, have both. Some maybe just have one, but there's a debate that they could also have 2. And I think that all these teams are top 10 teams, at least in my personal rankings. They're ranked number 4 through number 10. The top 3 are Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and those are teams that I think are kind of on the inside looking out in a certain sense. They're defending their fortress. These are the 3 teams, Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia, that are going to be assumed to be in the playoff this year. And in most years, you could also put Clemson in that position, even though last year was a pretty bad year by their standards. But anyway, I'm going to spend about a minute or 2 on each of these teams: Michigan, Utah, BYU, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Pittsburgh, and Arkansas. I'm going to spend about a minute or 2 on each of these teams just talking about them. And I've listed 3 reasons why each team could make it, 3 reasons why not. I've listed my personal ranking for them at the top of the screen with their name, my record prediction for the team in the regular season, and my floor and ceiling for each team. So first and foremost, let's start off with the number 4 team in my personal rankings, and that would be the Michigan Wolverines. Why can Michigan make the playoff? Well, they have a cupcake schedule. They have a loaded offense that returns 8 out of 11 starters from last year. And I would go as far to say that they have an elite staff. Their biggest loss on staff was DC Mike McDonald, but you could argue that Josh Gaddis leaving was not much of a loss. Sean Nua leaving and Mike Elston replacing him as the defensive line coach was, I would say, a big upgrade. Going back to the cupcake schedule, their toughest game is at Ohio State. I would say their next 2 toughest opponents in Nebraska and MSU, maybe even Penn State, are at home. At Iowa could be cause for concern, but Iowa really they don't have an offense. They lose a good chunk on offense. Tyler Linderbaum is probably their best player. They lose him to the draft along with running back Tyler Goodson. So Michigan has it easy with the schedule, loaded offense, elite staff, which is why I think they're going to go 11-1. And 8-1 in conference with 1 loss to Ohio State. Why can't they, though? Going back to the schedule, 2 tough rivals, and their schedule really doesn't prepare them for those 2 tough rivals. Michigan's schedule this past season did a really good job of preparing Michigan for what was to come. A road game, a tough road game against Penn State, against Nebraska, the home game at Washington, even though Washington was a bad 4-8 team, is probably going to be a tougher game than any of the non-conference games Michigan has this year against UConn, Colorado State, and some other, no offense, but completely irrelevant team to Michigan. Michigan State and Ohio State, and in my opinion, you could even put Nebraska up there, maybe even Penn State and Iowa. Those are going to be tough games, and Michigan's non-conference doesn't prepare them for them, and at Ohio State is going to be by far the toughest game, and no one on Michigan's schedule compares to at Ohio State, at least at the current moment. Preseason hype is also something that's dangerous for Michigan. It's been that way in the past. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but Michigan, when being ranked in the top 10 or close to it, the 2 years they weren't were 2021 and 2015, where they actually, overcame expectations. Every other year that they've been ranked close to the top 10 has been somewhat of a disappointment. And lastly, can Michigan replace that pass rush? And this is where the elite staff comes in, as an elite staff will find out a way to not completely replace it, as there were two possibly generational players in that pass rush, but find a way to make adjustments so Michigan can still have a great pass rush this coming season. Up next, we have Utah. Now, why can Utah reach the playoff? Well, Utah has a very versatile offense. Cameron Rising is a great passer. He is also a great runner. You also have good running back room for Utah. Utah they have really good tight ends and wide receivers. Could I name all of them or even most of them? No, but I watched them against Oregon. I watched them against Ohio State. Those weren't elite defenses, but still, they're really good. Utah's tight ends especially, they're so versatile with their tight ends. They can use them, for blocking, for receiving, and that sounds so simple, but a lot of schools, they don't have the versatility on offense that Utah does, where they can, have different and unique formations and actually make them work. Utah also has veteran depth. I read somewhere that Utah returns, a majority of their starters on both sides of the ball. Obviously, you lose, Devin Lloyd from the linebacker room, but I think that Utah returns a slew of players. Defense, offense, and the most important player on offense being Cameron Rising returns. Utah definitely has veteran depth that they can work with. And they also have an elite staff. Andrew Ludwig and Morgan Scally, I think I pronounced that name right, but maybe I didn't. Those are two really good coordinators. Ludwig, obviously, being the offensive coordinator, Scally, or maybe Scaly, being the defensive coordinator. Both really good guys. They know how to develop players. They know how to scheme, which is why I have Utah going 12-0 in a really weak Pac-12, probably having them win their conference championship. Michigan obviously losing to Ohio State indicates they won't be in their conference championship. But why can't Utah reach the playoff as opposed to why they could? Well, one is the Pac-12 resume. The Pac-12 resume is, to put it in simple and funny terms, Jackson State under Deion Sanders has as many 5 stars as the Pac-12 does when it comes to 2022 football commits. The Pac-12 is weak, both in terms of recruiting, reputation, and style of play. It's why Utah bullied Oregon twice this past season. It's exactly why. One loss in the Pac-12, it's safe to say I think that you would basically be booted out of the playoff conversation if there were 2 or more other undefeated teams who were likely to get into the playoff. Also, the pass defense. The pass defense last year was not good. It was not a top 25 passing defense in any way. In fact, I think that one of Utah's running backs was playing on the secondary. That's how much depth that the secondary lacked. It was exposed against Ohio State. And that kind of ties in with the linebacker room too. Noah Sewell and Devin Lloyd are off. They're gone. Their careers are finished at Utah. So how is Utah going to improve the pass defense and improve that linebacker core now that some great players have moved on? After Utah, we're now going on to BYU. Now, why can BYU reach the playoff? Which is, at this point, getting to be a repetitive question, but whatever. It's the theme of this video. Unlike some other schools, like Power 5 schools, where a strong schedule might persuade you and your chances away from entering the playoff because you're facing so much tough competition, for a school like BYU, you actually want the challenge. And any great coach wants the challenge, but for a school like BYU, Michigan, for example, can have a weak schedule, still reach the playoff at 12-0. maybe even 11-1, because there's that Power 5 bias, and some of it's understandable, some of it isn't, toward a Power 5 team that gives them benefit of the doubt. BYU doesn't have that because they're not a Power 5 team. They can't be like Notre Dame and play no one and get into the playoff every year. That's not how it works. But BYU this year, they host Baylor, who I have as my number 11 team. They host Arkansas, who I have as a number 10 team. They play at Oregon, who though I don't think will be really good in year one, it's still a Power 5 opponent on the road. It's going to be tough. And they played a neutral site game against Notre Dame. And I have them going 12-0. I think BYU is going to be one of the first two teams out of the playoff. They return everyone except two wide receivers and Tyler Algier, who was a huge loss. It was a massive loss, believe me. But they still have, 19 players returning when you count the offense and defense. It's phenomenal. There's obviously going to be growth there. So veteran depth is big. Strong schedule's big. The O-line ranked top 35 in numerous categories except for one, and they return all 5 of their players. And they bring in a good transfer from Oregon who was a little homesick, but that's still a great addition. The O-line should be really good for BYU. You also have a wide receiver named Puka Nakua, who should, in my opinion, have somewhat of a breakout year if he hasn't already. He transferred from Washington more than a year ago. I forget what year exactly. And Jaron Hall, really good quarterback as well. BYU on offense is at least pretty set. The defense has been limited, though. They do return everyone, but they had weaknesses this past season. They were not efficient by any means of the imagination. I think they were bottom 50, though you can double check me on that in ESPN's efficiency index. They also need to replace Tyler Algier at running back, which is going to be a challenge. He was a really good NFL tight back. He could carry BYU in specific games. And BYU is probably the least talented team on this list. I think they rank outside of the top 100 according to not ESPN, according to 24/7 Sports Team Talent Index. And that's from last year. We'll see if it changes this season. But they do not have great talent to work with, and that could kill them against teams like especially Notre Dame, who they meet at a neutral site. Up next, we have Oklahoma. Oklahoma, you lose a Lincoln Riley, you lose your best quarterback in Caleb Williams, your second best in Spencer Rattler. What do? And I mean, really, this is going to be a challenge for Oklahoma to possibly get there. I don't think they will. I have them going 10-2 in the regular season, 8-1. I have them going to the Big 12 championship game, but they have the offensive blueprint that Lincoln Riley left. I mean, you still have players that have worked under Lincoln Riley and played under him. You have Bill Biedenbaugh, you have Cale Gundy, and you also bring in, Jeff Lebby. Good thing I didn't forget his name. You're bringing him in from Ole Miss as the offensive coordinator and QB coach. You have a genius offensive blueprint, good offensive line coach to work with, great quarterbacks coach. You have everything. And you'll likely have, if you're an Oklahoma fan, you're going to likely have an improved defense because Brent Venables and Ted Roof on the same staff is kind of scary. I think it's better than what Alex Grinch gave Oklahoma. I mean, Oklahoma, their kryptonite has rarely been the offense, though in certain cases it was this past season. It's always been Alex Grinch's defense that has kind of killed them, if I'm being honest with you. And I think Oklahoma, they may not have the same staff because it's year one. There's not a whole lot of heft behind it because it's a new staff. Maybe it is an elite staff, actually, the more that I think about it. But they do, at minimum, have a great staff. And you could probably just cross it out and put elite, like Michigan and like Utah, what I have. It's a really good staff to work with, and I've already mentioned their names. These things, Oklahoma, with the talent they have, with how weak the Big 12 is, they could very well win the Big 12 and punch their ticket to the playoff. Why can't they? Offensive depth. There's a little bit of a question mark there because, you're bringing in Dylan Gabriel to play quarterback. You lost You lost countless of guys on offense to the transfer portal, who I couldn't name all of them, but still, it's a huge loss. You lost Caleb Williams. Most of the talented players, like the 5 stars out of high school, bolted for USC. Maybe that'll improve the culture at Oklahoma, but we'll have to see. Oklahoma does also have a tough schedule. That non-conference game at Nebraska is what I think mainly makes the tough schedule. Same with, we got to play teams like Baylor, Kansas State, Oklahoma State. The Nebraska addition to a Big 12 that I think is getting stronger, even though it's still relatively weak compared to the SEC and the Big 10. And then on all of that, adding in the fact that there's a coaching change, that's definitely a tough schedule for Oklahoma. And to go back to the offensive depth, there might be some green players. Oklahoma, I know, is also losing other guys on the defense specifically. Nick Benito, I think, is going off to the NFL draft as just an example of one. And there's another school in Oklahoma who I think can reach the CFP if things go their way. And it's because of their solid defensive line, workable schedule, solid defense overall. Kind of putting it up there twice, but the defensive line deserves its own. It deserves its own spot. It's so great. It was second in the nation in sacks. It helped Oklahoma State definitely win their bowl over Notre Dame to get, I think, only their second 12-win season in school history. Mike Gundy is a phenomenal coach. You could probably cross off one of these Ys and just put Mike Gundy as the sole reason. He's the only guy who's won this much at Oklahoma State. It's phenomenal. And they do have that workable schedule. They have an easy non-conference schedule. Yes, they have to travel at Oklahoma, but from what I can remember, some of their conference matchups, the home-away stuff, it works pretty well into their favor. And Derek Mason, I kind of put this as a why not with the new DC, because he's not Jim Knowles, but he's certainly a good DC. So he should he's kind of a bit of both. In a certain sense, the question marks surrounding him being new here and not being Jim Knowles, because Jim Knowles was, a great DC, and Derek Mason, Auburn's defense last year was great. Don't know if it could win Oklahoma State the Big 12, though. It's kind of in the middle. But the defense all around, they return a lot of guys. Mason could very well be a strength, but in the why not part, he may not be good enough to carry what I think is a mediocre defense in Oklahoma State, combined with QB dependability. Spencer Sanders, he probably had his best game of his career in the Fiesta Bowl, getting his team up, helping them charge back and beat the Irish. But he's not a very dependable QB. His passer rating keeps falling year in, year out. The name of the game, especially in the Big 12, has been offense, though Baylor and Oklahoma State were more defensive teams. So maybe in the Big 12, the name of the game, especially with Brent Venables being here now, maybe the name of the game is defense in the Big 12. I think Oklahoma State goes 10-2, 7-2 in conference. I think I'm having them lose to Baylor and Oklahoma, and I don't think they will reach the Big 12 championship, at least in my record predictions for now, but they very well could be. They very well could. I think that they could, in fact, win the Big 12 depending on how they play their cards. And now we're getting into some teams that I think they're bold. They're teams that I don't know as much about. You go further down the list, I'm not as much of an expert on these teams. Pittsburgh, I'm probably more of an expert on than, let's just say, Oklahoma State, or maybe even Oklahoma. But Pittsburgh I have as the number 9 team. I have them going 11-1 in the regular season, 8-1. I think they're going to lose to Miami on the final game of the regular season as their sole conference loss. Why can they? Well, they return the entire offensive line, which is a group that certainly can improve. They return, I think, all, and if not all but one of their defensive line, which is their defensive line, again, along with Oklahoma State, was one of the top in the nation. They have great trench play all around. They also, defense, they return a lot of guys on defense. As I already mentioned with the defensive line, they keep their defensive coordinator, whereas You know, Mark Whipple is off to Nebraska, so they have that change at OC. Defense is staying pretty consistent. They've brought in some transfers as well to help fill voids on defense. A safety from Michigan State, and I think a linebacker from Notre Dame. So that defense is going to get only more solid. They also have an X-Factor wide receiver in Jordan Addison. He's an X-Factor guy, and I think having a guy like Keaton Slovis, and I think Nick Patty is the backup. Yes, Nick Patty is the backup. Either of those, just looking at how Nick Patty played in the first drive against MSU, I think him or Slovis will be a solid QB. They won't be Pickett, but I think the ACC is going to be weaker this coming season, much like this past season. I think Clemson, with just the amount of staff turnover they've had with the weaker recruiting class they've brought in, and just the uncertainty, it's safe to say, in my opinion, the ACC is going to need more than just a year to get back. But maybe that's not the case. And another reason why Pittsburgh may completely just miss the mark, because this is a very bold prediction. This record prediction is probably the boldest out of all these teams in this video. The QB replacement, Slovis and Patty are not Pickett. And Pickett, if we're being honest, to draw a similarity between Pat Narduzzi and Michigan State, where he used to be defensive coordinator, Pickett carried Pitt in a similar way that Walker carried Michigan State. The difference is Pitt is in a much easier conference, and that's basically the main difference. And Pittsburgh has probably a more solid defense. But that QB replacement, if Slovis and Patty aren't what I think they are, could be very dangerous for the Panthers and their hopes to compete for a national title, as one of their players said about a week ago. They also, their linebacker, that's why they're bringing in a guy from Notre Dame. I think they lose both of their starting linebackers, one or two, that I read in an article. Again, not the greatest expert. I do have an inconsistent schedule, and I am in school, so I can't know everything, but from what I have gathered from articles, they do have a newish, greenish linebacker core. And the ACC resume, it's not as bad as the Pac-12 resume, but it can be bad if you have a loss or two, and if you aren't Clemson. And last but not least, you got KJ Jefferson's Arkansas. An amazing QB play is listed up there because, yeah, the offensive line should be solid for Arkansas. I think they returned 3 offensive lineman starters, and they had some guys in the rotation. They have tons of impact transfers coming in. They have a guy from Alabama coming in, a guy from Georgia. I think they also have a guy from Oklahoma. That right there, Power 5 incoming transfers, guys who were starting or competing for starting spots on good teams, is critical. Absolutely critical. And I can't wait to see what they do at Arkansas. I think Arkansas is going to go 10-2, 7-1 in conference. I think they're losing at BYU and they're losing to Alabama. But I think this is going to be one of the teams to beat in the SEC. KJ Jefferson is amazing. He's amazing on the ground. He's amazing in the air. He threw little picks, which is something that's very hard to do when you are a dual threat guy, especially in the land of offense, especially passing offense, which is what college football is becoming. I'm really impressed with what Sam Pittman is doing there, and I do think Arkansas is going to be a really good team this coming season. Why can't they, though? You have a talent disadvantage within the SEC. Arkansas's 2022 recruiting class was 13th in the SEC. I think only Florida or Vanderbilt was behind them. And I say Vanderbilt because they had a pretty good recruiting class this past cycle. But you do have a talent disadvantage compared to the rest of the SEC. You don't have poor talent compared to the rest of the nation. You have top 25 talent, but it's the SEC. The SEC, everyone except Vanderbilt, for the most part, has top 25 talent. Arkansas certainly has a talent disparity compared to Alabama, compared to Georgia, compared to LSU, compared to Texas A&M. I just rattled off 3 teams in their own conference, let alone division. 4 if you count conference. New leadership, too. They return starters on the offensive line, they bring in impact transfers, but overall, this team is losing a lot of production. One of their star wide receivers, their main star, is off to the NFL, and their defense loses a lot. It's why I didn't put up solid defense as a possible strength. I think their defense loses the majority of their starters. So new leadership, new players, whether they're transfers, backups, are going to have to step up and help the Hogs with their chances of possibly punching their first ticket to the CFP ever. Their first ticket to potentially even a New Year's Six Bowl for the first time in ages since the Bobby Petrino era. And tough schedule, which ties into the talent disadvantage even further. Arkansas, they have BYU as a non-conference game, who I think everyone can say is at least going to be a tough team, and then you have an SEC schedule on top of that. It's horrible. That's tough. Luckily, Arkansas hosts Alabama, and I say if you're going to play Alabama, you want to host them. You don't want to play away at Bryant-Denny Stadium. It's a nightmare, but that's probably the only positive of Arkansas's tough and daunting schedule. Certainly going to be one of the top 10 schedules in the nation, ranked by toughest. Keep in mind, these rankings are early, and this is where the video is pretty much going to end. These rankings are early. I don't have infinite amounts of time to gather information on these teams. This is just speculation, my opinion, what I've read, all jumbled into one video. After spring ball is close to over, and after a lot of the spring, the spring football games, the spring scrimmages where, they're televised on live TV, when a lot of those are over, when I can actually watch the teams play, and I intend on watching most Power 5, some Group of 5, if not all Power 5 and most Group of 5 teams play, I will have a lot more better information, a lot better perspective. My rankings might change dramatically. Some of these teams that are on here, maybe even half of them, might not be on a similar list to this after spring ball is over. That's how impactful spring ball is. But thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. What teams do you think are on the outside looking in? They're so close, but they're not the Ohio States, Alabamas, and Georgias. They have to work much harder to get there, but they're not a dark horse playoff contender either. They're somewhere in the middle between an assumed contender and a dark horse. Tell me down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.